August 15, 1989, Houston, Texas. Viktor Belenko walked through the automatic doors of a Kroger supermarket on Memorial Drive and stopped. The Soviet MiG-25 pilot who had defected 13 years earlier thought he had seen everything America could offer. He had toured American aircraft factories, examined the advanced avionics that made Soviet systems look primitive, met with aerospace engineers whose understanding of materials science exceeded anything Soviet institutes had achieved. He thought he understood the technological gap between the two superpowers. He was wrong. Standing at the entrance to 52,000 square feet of retail space, Belenko confronted something more devastating than any military technology. Abundance, so overwhelming that his Soviet upbringing had left him completely unprepared. 50 aisles stretched before him. Fresh produce in quantities he'd never imagined. Meat counters displaying dozens of cuts. Entire sections dedicated to breakfast cereals, not the 5 types available in Moscow's best stores, but 50. He counted them. 50 different breakfast cereals. Belenko stood in the frozen food section and cried. Everything they told us was a lie, he whispered to his American escort. Everything. Life in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 1980s meant accepting scarcity as the fundamental condition of existence. Viktor Belenko had grown up in Nalchik, a city in the North Caucasus, where his mother waited 3 hours every week to buy their family's bread ration. This wasn't poverty by Soviet standards. This was normal. Every Soviet citizen knew these routines. You woke early. You joined the queue before the store opened. You waited, hoping today's delivery would include what you needed. You bought what was available, not what you wanted, because wanting implied choice, and choice didn't exist. The Communist Party taught, through schools and Pravda newspaper and mandatory political education classes, that American abundance was propaganda. Staged photographs. Bourgeois excess built on exploitation of the working class. American workers starved, while capitalists hoarded wealth. Soviet citizens might face temporary shortages as the socialist system perfected itself, but they were building a glorious future that would surpass anything the decadent West could achieve. The propaganda was consistent, repeated daily, reinforced through every institution. And for Soviet citizens who had never traveled abroad, who had never seen American stores, who had no basis for comparison beyond what their government told them, the propaganda seemed plausible. The reality of Soviet stores was 3 types of sausage when you were lucky, 2 colors of shoes, black and brown, and if your size wasn't in stock, you bought the wrong size and stuffed newspaper in the toes to make them fit. Toilet paper available twice monthly at distribution points, 2 rolls per family. Fresh oranges only during New Year's celebrations, distributed through workplace committees to deserving Communist Party members. Belenko's wife had worn shoes 2 sizes too large for 3 years because size 38 hadn't been available and she needed shoes for work. His sister had waited 8 months for a replacement picture tube for their Riga 17 television set because replacement parts came through official channels that moved at bureaucratic pace. The state stores in Moscow, particularly Gum department store on Red Square, represented the showcase of Soviet retail. Foreign visitors were taken there to see Soviet shopping at its finest. Even Gum, with its special access to supplies, offered potatoes, onions, and cabbage as staples. Sometimes beets, sometimes carrots. Belenko remembered seeing oranges at Gum once during a trip to Moscow. The line was 3 hours long. He joined it immediately. You didn't pass up oranges. They sold out before he reached the front. His son had never tasted fresh oranges except during New Year's distribution at his school, where party membership of parents determined allocation priority. But Soviet propaganda promised that these sacrifices were temporary. The 5-year plans were succeeding. Soviet agricultural production exceeded Western levels. Soviet industrial capacity outpaced capitalist economies. If stores seemed empty, it was because Soviet citizens enjoyed such prosperity that demand exceeded supply, a sign of success, not failure. Pravda published statistics proving Soviet living standards surpassed American levels. Soviet citizens earned less in rubles, but enjoyed free healthcare, free education, guaranteed employment. Americans had consumer goods, but no security, no certainty, no protection from capitalist exploitation. The Soviet system, for all its current imperfections, represented humanity's future. September 6, 1976, Viktor Belenko demonstrated what he thought of that future by stealing a MiG-25 Foxbat interceptor and flying it to Hakodate Airport in Japan. The defection shocked Soviet leadership and provided American intelligence with the most detailed look at advanced Soviet military aircraft they had ever received. CIA officers extracted Belenko from Japan 3 days later and flew him to Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, D.C. The flight passed in a blur of incomprehension for Belenko. From the aircraft window, America looked impossible. Highways 8 lanes wide, parking lots filled with thousands of cars, shopping centers larger than entire Moscow districts. Belenko pressed his face to the window and counted private automobiles. In 10 minutes flying over suburban Washington, he saw more cars than existed in all of Nalchik, more cars than he'd seen in his entire life. Every parking lot was full. Every driveway had 1 or 2 vehicles. Some had 3. These weren't special government vehicles or party member privileges. These were regular people, ordinary Americans, each owning cars that would represent years of savings for a Soviet family. The CIA safe house in Virginia was a middle-class American home. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a garage, central heating and air conditioning throughout. The refrigerator was larger than the one shared by 6 families in Belenko's Moscow apartment building, and it was full. Not partially full, not stocked with carefully rationed items, full of food, fresh food, vegetables, fruits, meat, cheese, drinks. More food in this one refrigerator than Belenko's family could acquire in a month of shopping in Soviet stores. "This must be special," Belenko said to his CIA escort. "For important defectors, special housing." The CIA officer laughed. "This is just a rental, pretty standard American suburban house. My place is bigger. I've got 4 bedrooms. Belenko didn't believe him. It was too much. This couldn't be normal. It couldn't be real. The Americans were showing him propaganda, just like Soviet propaganda, but in reverse. They were staging abundance to impress him. But as weeks passed and he saw more of America, the terrible truth emerged. This was normal. This was how regular Americans lived. The abundance wasn't staged. It was everywhere. 3 years passed before Belenko fully adjusted to American life. He worked as an aerospace consultant, his expertise on Soviet aviation systems valuable to American defense contractors. He learned English, studied American culture, tried to understand how this society had created such overwhelming prosperity. By 1989, he thought he had seen everything. He had toured Boeing factories where production lines assembled commercial aircraft at scales Soviet industry couldn't imagine. He had visited Silicon Valley, where companies he'd never heard of created computer technology that exceeded anything Soviet research institutes possessed. He understood intellectually that America was wealthier, more technologically advanced, more productive than the Soviet Union. But intellectual understanding wasn't emotional comprehension. On August 15, 1989, when his American friends suggested visiting a grocery store, just a regular neighborhood supermarket, nothing special, Belenko agreed casually. He'd been in American stores before. He knew they were larger than Soviet stores, better stocked, more diverse. He thought he was prepared. The Kroger supermarket on Memorial Drive in Houston occupied 52,000 square feet of retail space. Belenko walked through automatic doors that opened without human intervention, a small luxury that Soviet stores never had, and confronted the produce section. 8 varieties of tomatoes, not 8 individual tomatoes to be divided among customers, but 8 varieties of tomatoes, each variety available in quantities that would stock an entire Soviet store. 6 types of lettuce, fresh herbs he'd never heard of, grown in greenhouses and available year-round. Fruits imported from Chile, Mexico, Ecuador, countries he'd been taught were suffering under American imperialism, yet somehow they grew fruit for American tables. In Moscow's gum department store, the Soviet Union's showcase shopping center, Built to impress foreign visitors, the produce section offered potatoes, onions, and cabbage when available. Sometimes beets, sometimes carrots in winter. Once Belenko had seen apples, but they were small, bruised, expensive, and the line was 90 minutes long. Here, the produce section was larger than the entire ground floor of gum. Apples came in a dozen varieties. Oranges were piled in bins. Take what you want. How many? How many do you want? The question made no sense. You took what was available. You didn't choose. But here, choice was assumed. The question wasn't whether oranges were available, but how many varieties you preferred. The meat counter broke something inside him. Not just beef, 15 cuts of beef, each labelled and displayed behind clean glass. Chicken in pieces, not the whole frozen birds that were mostly bones that Soviet stores carried when they carried chicken at all. Fresh fish on ice, eyes clear. None of the questionable smell that Soviet fish markets had. Pork, lamb, cuts Belenko didn't recognize because Soviet butchers didn't separate meat this way. The butcher, a young man probably 25 years old, smiled at Belenko and asked what he wanted. Asked. Like Belenko was the customer, and the butcher worked for him, not like Belenko was a supplicant hoping for favor from the man who controlled access to scarce goods. In Moscow, you bought what the state provided. If pork arrived on Thursday, you bought pork on Thursday, or you went without pork. You didn't choose beef instead. Beef wasn't available. Nothing was available on demand. Things became available on schedule determined by distribution systems and 5-year plans and logistics that regular citizens couldn't influence. Here, everything was available. Not sometimes available. Not available if you were lucky. Available. Today, tomorrow, next week, every week. The economic implications were staggering, but the cereal aisle was what destroyed Belenko's emotional composure. He walked down the aisle slowly, counting boxes. 50 types of breakfast cereal. Not 50 boxes. 50 different types, different brands, different flavors, different companies competing for customers. Frosted Flakes with Tony the Tiger smiling from the package. Cheerios, cornflakes, Rice Krispies, brands he'd never heard of, each with variations. Regular, honey, chocolate, fruit-flavored. The variety was incomprehensible. In Soviet stores, when cereal was available, you might find 5 types if you were very lucky, usually 2 or 3. Oatmeal was most common, sometimes cornflakes, sometimes a rice cereal that tasted like cardboard. You bought what was there and considered yourself fortunate to find any cereal at all. Here, the choice was overwhelming. Belenko picked up a box of Frosted Flakes. The price was $2.49. He did the calculation automatically. At official exchange rates, this was 3 rubles. But at black market rates, the real rates that reflected actual purchasing power, this box of cereal cost more than a Soviet engineer earned in a full day of work. And Americans bought it casually, throwing boxes in their shopping carts without thinking, without calculating, without determining if they could afford this luxury. How much do Americans earn? Belenko asked his escort. Average household? Maybe $25,000 a year. Belenko converted the numbers. 10 times the average Soviet salary in nominal terms. But in actual purchasing power, considering what these dollars could buy, versus what rubles bought, probably 30 times, maybe more. And that was average. Not elite, not party officials, average Americans. Regular people buying 50 types of breakfast cereal without considering it remarkable. This is for everyone. Belenko waved at the aisles. Not special stores for party members. His escort looked confused by the question. This? This is just a regular grocery store. There's 3 more within 5 miles. This isn't even the biggest. There's a place called Whole Foods that's twice this size, all organic and specialty items. The electronics department sat in the back corner. Televisions, 20 models, not the 2 types available in Soviet stores when available. 20 different brands, different sizes, different features. Color televisions with remote controls. Video cassette recorders that could record programs off the air. Technology that didn't exist in Soviet consumer markets. Portable televisions. The variety exceeded anything Belenko had imagined. He owned a Riga 17 television in Moscow, black and white. 3 channels, all state-controlled. It broke constantly. Replacement parts took 6 months to acquire through official channels, or 2 months if you knew someone who knew someone at the repair depot. His wife had been waiting for a new picture tube for 8 months when he defected. These televisions worked. They came with warranties. If they broke, you brought them back and got a new one or got it repaired immediately. The concept was alien. In the Soviet Union, ownership meant endless repair. Nothing worked properly. Everything broke. Getting it fixed was your problem. Finding parts was your problem. Knowing someone who could do unofficial repairs was essential because official repair shops had 6-month waiting lists. Here, repair was the manufacturer's problem. Customer satisfaction was assumed. The economic relationship was inverted completely. An American teenager walked past, Sony Walkman headphones around his neck. Belenko recognized the Sony logo. Japanese electronics, forbidden in the USSR, except for high-party officials, casually worn by a high school student. The boy was probably 16 years old. He owned better personal electronics than Soviet scientists. He owned it casually, without considering it remarkable because this was normal American middle-class life. The clothing section explained something Belenko had never understood about American movies. He'd thought the costumes were propaganda, showing Americans dressed in clothes that didn't exist, wearing different outfits every day, having choices about what to wear. But here were racks of shirts in every color imaginable, jeans in different styles, different cuts, different brands, shoes by the dozens, not the black or brown choice that Soviet stores offered when they had shoes in stock. In Moscow, you wore what was available, black shoes or brown shoes. That was the choice. If your size wasn't in stock, you bought the wrong size and made it work, stuffing newspaper in too large shoes or cramping your feet into too small ones. His wife wore shoes 2 sizes too large, stuffed with newspaper, because size 38 hadn't been available for 3 years. She needed shoes for work, so she bought what was available and adapted. Here, a woman tried on 8 pairs of shoes, examining them from different angles, considering how they looked, how they felt, whether they matched her clothes. And then she left without buying anything. She just left, didn't buy anything. The abundance was so overwhelming that people could be choosy. They could reject perfectly good shoes because they didn't like the style or the color, or the way they felt. This level of choice exceeded anything Soviet citizens experienced in any aspect of their lives. At the checkout counter, Belenko watched the cashier, young woman, maybe 25 years old. She chatted with customers, smiled, made jokes, treated them like human beings, not supplicants begging for goods. The interaction was friendly, casual, respectful. The cashier served the customers. The customers weren't grateful for the privilege of being allowed to buy things. They were casual, matter-of-fact, because this was normal. This was expected. In Soviet stores, clerks were Stalin's heirs. They controlled access to scarce goods. You approached with deference, hoping they were in a good mood. You didn't complain about quality or selection, because complaint meant the clerk might refuse to serve you next time. Friendship with a shop clerk was valuable. She might save items under the counter for you, call when something good arrived, give you priority in the queue. The clerk held power, and you were dependent on her favor. Here, the economic relationship was completely reversed. The store needed customers. Customers didn't need any particular store. There were 3 more within 5 miles, his escort had said. The cashier was friendly because customer satisfaction mattered. Bad service meant customers went elsewhere. Good service meant they returned. The market was competitive. Choice was real. The entire system was built on abundance rather than scarcity. Service rather than control. The cashier saw Belenko staring and smiled. Finding everything okay? He couldn't answer. What could he say? That everything he'd been taught was a lie? That the Soviet system he'd served was revealed as a cruel joke? That American exploitation of workers meant workers who could choose from 50 types of breakfast cereal, while Soviet workers' paradise meant waiting 3 hours for potatoes, that his mother had spent 3 hours every week in lines to buy bread while American mothers spent 15 minutes in stores like this buying more food than Soviet families acquired in months. That the ideological struggle between capitalism and socialism had been settled here, in this supermarket, in these aisles of overwhelming abundance that demolished every claim Soviet propaganda had ever made. Everything they told us was a lie, Belenko repeated. The words were inadequate. The lie wasn't just about abundance. The lie was about everything. The lie was that socialism was superior, that the Soviet system protected workers, that capitalism exploited and impoverished, that American abundance was propaganda. The lie was comprehensive, total, fundamental to everything Soviet citizens were taught to believe. That night in the Virginia safe house, Viktor Belenko faced the implications of what he'd seen. The Soviet embassy in Washington had declared him a traitor. His family in Nalchik, his mother, his sister, his nephew, would face interrogation by the KGB. Association with a defector meant consequences, lost jobs, denied education, surveillance. They would pay for his decision. His mother, who had spent 3 hours every week in lines to buy their family's bread, would now face additional punishment because her son had chosen freedom. But returning meant living a lie, pretending he hadn't seen what he'd seen, going back to empty store shelves and 3-hour queues while knowing that across the ocean, teenagers owned better electronics than Soviet generals. Going back to a system where the most advanced military aircraft in the Soviet arsenal, the MiG-25 he'd flown, used vacuum tubes instead of transistors, where welding was so crude that Soviet technicians joked about it, where the unstoppable Soviet superweapon was a technological embarrassment compared to American systems. The CIA offered full protection, new identity if he wanted it, American citizenship, education, career opportunities, freedom to speak publicly or stay silent. And if that was true of their most advanced military systems, what did it say about everything else? The Soviet Union was falling behind not just in consumer goods, not just in computers and electronics, but in the fundamental technologies that determined military power and economic prosperity. The regime was built on lies about its capabilities. The lies were revealing themselves to anyone who looked. The supermarket was just the most visible, most comprehensible manifestation of a gap that extended across every domain of human activity. "I'm staying," Belenko told his CIA contact. "There's nothing to go back to." Viktor Belenko would spend the next 40 years in the United States. He became an aerospace consultant, his expertise on Soviet aviation systems valuable to American defense contractors. He wrote a memoir, MiG Pilot, The Final Escape of Lieutenant Belenko, describing his life in the Soviet Union and his defection. He became an author and lecturer, explaining Soviet society to American audiences who struggled to understand how such a system could persist. His technical debriefings on the MiG-25 revealed the extent of Soviet technological backwardness to American intelligence. But his supermarket story proved more valuable than any military secrets. Other defectors reported the same pattern. The first trip to an American grocery store broke something fundamental. Soviet scientists, athletes, diplomats, trained Marxist-Leninists who'd memorized Das Kapital and understood dialectical materialism, all experienced the same shock. The abundance was impossible to rationalize away. The variety couldn't be explained as waste or inefficiency. The casual nature of American consumption demolished claims about capitalist exploitation of workers. Svetlana Alliluyeva, Joseph Stalin's daughter, defected in 1967. She later wrote, "I could not believe my eyes when I saw American stores. They told us Americans were starving. They told us capitalism was collapsing. In Moscow, we had to wait in line for hours for the most basic necessities. Sometimes we waited and the store had nothing. In New York, I walked into a grocery store and burst into tears. The abundance was overwhelming. Everything was available. Nobody was waiting in lines. People just came, bought what they wanted, and left. I realized everything I'd been taught was lies." The pattern repeated throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Soviet citizens who saw America, diplomats, trade delegations, athletes, journalists, scientists on exchange programs, returned home changed. They'd seen the truth. They knew the reality. The whispers spread through Soviet society. American workers lived better than Soviet party officials. American poverty meant owning a used car and a color television. Soviet prosperity meant waiting 3 hours for potatoes. The propaganda couldn't survive contact with reality. By 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, millions of East Germans poured into West Berlin. Their first destination wasn't government buildings or monuments. They went to grocery stores. They stood in the aisles and cried, just like Viktor Belenko 13 years earlier. The images were broadcast worldwide. The Soviet system's failure was visible in the tears of ordinary people overwhelmed by Western supermarkets. The abundance that Americans considered normal, that they hardly noticed, was revelation to people who'd lived under socialism. The supermarket became a weapon more powerful than the SR-71 Blackbird or the Ohio-class submarine. It demonstrated American superiority not in classified briefings or military exercises, but on shelves visible to anyone who walked through the door. 50 types of breakfast cereal destroyed communist ideology more effectively than any military victory could have. The variety, the abundance, the casual nature of consumption, the competitive market providing choice, these weren't propaganda, these were simple facts, and facts defeated propaganda. America won the Cold War the moment Soviet citizens saw how American citizens lived. Everything that came after, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Warsaw Pact, the democratization of Eastern Europe, followed inevitably from that first moment of recognition. They had planned to fight capitalism with communist efficiency. But America fought with abundance, prosperity, and the simple truth that its workers ate better than the Soviet Union's elite. Soviet Union planned to defeat capitalism with ideological purity and worker solidarity. America won with breakfast cereal and automatic doors and 20 types of television and meat counters where the butcher asked what you wanted. The Cold War wasn't won in missile silos or aircraft carriers or tank battles. It was won in supermarket aisles where Soviet defectors stood crying, overwhelmed by abundance they'd been taught didn't exist, confronting the lie their entire society had been built upon. 50 types of cereal versus 5. 3,000 miles of ocean couldn't hide that gap. No amount of propaganda could explain it away.